So, to kind of build off what we have been talking about when it comes to Latin America, both in large group and in lab, we're going to do kind of two things here. We're going to recap some of the big ideas behind Marxism and communism, and particularly why they were appealing to the people of Latin America. So there's a real linkage between the ideas of Marx when he's writing in the 1800s and how those ideas get applied and picked up by many different groups in Latin America, most notably Fidel Castro, who pulls off a successful communist revolution in Cuba. So the history of Marxism is deeply tied to the history of Latin America, and we're going to also look specifically, there are many things we could look at the history of Cuba. Hopefully this will provide you the backdrop to help make more sense out of your reading for the Socratic discussion. So you've seen this slide before almost exactly when we did that lab a couple months ago called Rock, Paper, Scissors, Karl Marx. And that's probably the big thing you took away and remembered, the fact that we played that cool paperclip game. But in addition to the paperclip game, we also explored a couple of these ideas briefly. Marx argued in his life in the mid-1800s that the economic system that dominated his world and the world of a lot of people, capitalism, was a big problem. Much of Marx's intellectual life is spent criticizing capitalism. And let me just revisit the 10-second definition of capitalism. It is that economic system that's based on the owning of private property and the pursuit and using that private property to generate profit. It's the economic system we have today. It's characterized by a market economy. It's not the government owning the property. It's individuals and corporations and shareholders. And the idea is everybody's pursuing their own self-interest. And capitalists would argue that this is a flourishing, successful system because it allows for the creation of the best technology, the most innovation, and it rewards people who come up with valuable things. That's capitalism in its ideal form. Marx thought that that was a terrible system. Or, while he would concede that it produces a lot of things like technology and innovation, it has some real downsides. So let me just point out two big criticisms of capitalism that Marx spent much of his life talking about. Number one, capitalism is exploitative. It takes advantage of people who don't have a lot of power in society. It manipulates them. It forces them to accept low-wage jobs. It rewards some people who have maybe access to resources or very valuable skills, and it allows them to get fantastically wealthy. But Marx would argue that many people who don't have access to resources or don't have particular sets of skills that are valuable, they're forced into this exploited class in society. And they're taken advantage of by those who have those abilities. So he doesn't like that. He also argues capitalism is unstable and it's chaotic, and there's a boom and bust cycle of the market economy, and while wealthy people can sometimes withstand the shocks of that boom and bust, poor people or people who are living hand to mouth or people who have just a little bit of savings, that they're always going to be on the short end of the stick when it comes to the boom and bust cycle and the chaos of capitalism. And Marx argues, and this is a big part of what he says in his writings, that this system, through its exploitation, its oppression, and its instability, is going to be unacceptable to people in the long run. Marx says that in the future, there's going to be a revolution, and it's going to lead to the overthrow of capitalism. The reason I mention these two things first is because those trends that Marx criticized in capitalism, that's at the heart of Latin American history. If you're a Latin American peasant who's maybe working for a multinational corporation or working for a very low wage in a mine somewhere in central Mexico or Nicaragua or Guatemala or parts of Chile, these may seem like very relatable truths to you. This maybe gives you some explanatory power to make sense of your world, the world that is you being exploited and you being forced to take on an oppressed position. So a lot of people in Latin America are going to be drawn to Marx's ideas. So a couple other big ideas with Marx. He argues that the leading group in a capitalist society is what's called the bourgeoisie. They're the owning class. class. Marx says that this is the group that holds property. They control the means of production. If you want specific examples, these are the bankers, the merchants, the manufacturers, the investors, the people who sit on boards of directors, the people who own lots of shares in companies. That's the bourgeoisie. They prosper under capitalism. But Marx says they are pitted against this other class of people that's actually much bigger in number, and that's called the proletariat. The proletariat to Marx, this is the wage-earning, propertyless class, the people who don't have wealth, power, or do not control any means of production. The means of production kind of ties it all together for Marx. Means of production means the raw materials, the machines, the tools to produce things of value. Marx goes out and says, whoever controls the means of production controls a society. Under capitalism, it's the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat are along for the ride. But he says, eventually that's going to be unstable, and there's going to be a revolution. So what's going to replace it? Marx argues that this new system, called socialism, offers an alternative. It offers some opportunity. Socialism, quickly, the 10-second definition, it's where the state or the government owns and controls the property in society. They control the means of production. They control the distribution of goods. And this is appealing, especially if you're a propertyless peasant or you're working in a mine somewhere and you're getting paid a very small wage labor job or wage labor position. You can look at Marx and you can look at socialism as, this is an opportunity for me to improve myself. I'm not at the mercy of some soulless corporation anymore. I now can have the backing of my government and my state, which will make sure that I have food, clothing, shelter, and an opportunity to get educated, and health care, and a bunch of other things. So that is why Marx is pretty appealing. Just quickly here, Marx has a theory of history. You've seen this before. He believes a revolution will happen. He believes that capitalism will destroy itself. In the Communist Manifesto, he famously says, capitalism and the bourgeoisie sows the seeds of their own destruction. By exploiting people, they're eventually digging their own graves. And that eventually socialism will replace it, a system where the government controls the means of production and it can better look out for the needs of people. I just want to talk about two of these contrasts so you get it straight in your mind. Under capitalism, ownership is private. Private individuals own factories and farms and other means of production. They do so because they're pursuing their own self-interest. They're taking on that ownership role and they're taking on... I know it's embarrassing. Everybody's like, I'm not in that situation. So, sorry to put you on the spot, but you caught me right at the pause. So, where was I? Self-interest. Under capitalism, you're pursuing your self-interest because you have a prospect of profit or reward. You can get fantastically wealthy, you can live in a big house, you can get lots of possession, lots of social control, and so forth. That's capitalism. It says, if you want the best stuff and the best technology and innovation, you got to unleash people's selfishness. That's how you're going to get to the best stuff for everybody. Marxism says, no, you need progress for all, cooperation. So it's not some CEO and board of directors and set of shareholders who reap the profits from a factory or a farm. It's going to be the workers themselves. So wherever you see a Marxist revolution happening, that's usually one of the first things that they'll try to get rid of, is they'll try to get rid of or limit private property and have it be owned by the government, because there the resources can be distributed more fairly. So I just want to draw that contrast. When it comes to Latin America and elsewhere in the world, Marx was very mindful of the fact that capitalism tries to get other people to participate. It tends to spread out and move its tentacles into other societies, into other economies, and get them to participate in the system. This is a quote from the Communist Manifesto. We're not going to analyze this quote in a written form. I just want to read it to you to emphasize a point. The bourgeoisie, or the owning class, Marx says, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization, meaning no matter who you are, where you live on the globe, whether you're industrialized or not, capitalism is going to find you. It's going to look for your natural resources, it's going to look for things that you need, and it's going to try to interweave itself into your system. The cheap prices of its commodities, the things you can buy and sell, are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls. Note that Marx, writing in the 1840s during the time of the Opium Wars, where Britain essentially goes to war with China so it can sell an addictive drug known as opium, with which it forces barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate, to give up. It compels nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. So Marx believes that capitalism is kind of self-replicating. It tries to get people who don't even want to participate in it to participate. I want you to think of the experience of the Latin American peasant in Guatemala, or a mine worker in central Mexico, or someone in Central America, or in Bolivia in South America. Maybe they have their own independence. Maybe they have their own independent country. But foreign corporations show up and they begin to own land, acres and acres of it for fruit production. Or they begin to own a mountain range for mining silver or some other precious metal. And they see all of their friends and neighbors employed in these jobs. While they technically are their own independent country, a lot of those people would not feel they're in control of their own lives or in control of their own destiny. And they would see that because kind of what Marx is saying is that capitalism, through its markets, through the interests of corporations and prices and commodities, would kind of ensnare them into their world. So I'm just going to move through this pretty quickly, but I think it's an important linkage. Why does Marxism appeal in Latin America? What is it about Latin America that makes it a seductive set of ideas? Latin America, its history, we know this, is deeply shaped by oppression and exploitation. Those are two ideas that Marx spent a lot of time talking about. We know, going back to the Spanish conquest, 1500s, Spanish, Portuguese show up. We did the lab activity where we analyzed the 6 documents that talk about how the Spanish reshaped Latin America. We know that a lot of that, for those who survived the initial wave of disease, was oppression and exploitation. Think of the encomienda system, forcing people to work in that sharecropper existence of the big haciendas or mining corporations that was designed to extract wealth and send it back to a mother country. So it's very much in the cultural memory of people in Latin America that this is our truth. This is real for us. So they would look at Marx and they'd say, this is making a lot of sense. This is our history. And as a result, since they have that common history, they can look at socialism and the ideas of socialism as an opportunity to the common people. In many cases, socialism would be an improvement to the situation many people would find themselves in Latin America. So let me give you some specific examples. What does socialism offer the people of Latin America? Whatever the movement was, there are some key ideas that any socialist movement, whether it's happening in Cuba or Mexico or somewhere in South America, they tended to focus on. One was this: redistribute the land. Mrs. Clark talked a bit about this Tuesday in the Guatemala example. Jacobo Arbenz, one of the first things he did when he came to power in Guatemala, he took land from the United Fruit Company and he redistributed it to poor people in his own country. A good part of socialism means taking private property away and redistributing it to people who need it. In this case, poor peasant farmers. The nationalization of natural resources. A socialist revolutionary group would say, no longer should it be some soulless international corporation that controls our oil supply or our precious metals supply. It should be the people of our country. So they would argue that the government, not some international corporation, should control those things. So that means if there is an international corporation in control of it now, take it back. take back those oil rigs, take back those silver mines. Put them to use for the people of whatever that country is. Socialist movement would say that. Finally, socialists would spend a lot of time talking about the creation of public investments like schools or infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, things that could be accessed and used by everybody in the society, not just the privileged few who happen to hold most of the private property. Finally, a socialist movement really would stress the importance of labor unions. The idea that laborers in factories and mines and in agriculture should band together and, if necessary, go on strike against the ownership so that they can get better wages or better benefits, and is a way of kind of protecting themselves against the cruelties and indifference of the capitalist market. This right here, keep that image in mind. Those are workers in a Cuban sugar plantation. In many cases, they're going to be some of the most oppressed people in all of Latin America. In many cases, the Cuban sugar plantations are going to have a handful of very large owners or corporations who control them, the prices, and the destiny of their workers, and the workers themselves work for long, long hours with very minimal compensation. So, I want to just stress a couple big ideas to kind of now transition from talking about Marxism to talking about the history of Cuba. And this will help you make sense of your Socratic discussion. The history of Cuba is very much part of the history of the United States. If you go back all the way to the 1820s, the United States develops a policy during the presidency of James Monroe. You do not need to know who James Monroe is, but just know that the U.S. has this policy of what becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine, because Monroe and his administration says it first. Every U.S. president that comes up with kind of a unique foreign policy, if they're the first to say it, it gets called their doctrine. Like we have the Bush Doctrine and the Obama Doctrine and so on. So, Monroe says it should be the policy of the United States to keep Europe, the nations of Europe, whether it's Britain, France, Germany, whoever, out of the Western Hemisphere. They should not be allowed to go back and establish colonies. This is during the movement of a lot of those independence movements where various Latin American nations were declaring their independence from Spain. So Monroe says, essentially, Europe needs to stay out and not come back. Doesn't say anything about the U.S., but says Europe should stay out. One other key flashpoint in the interaction between the United States and Latin America is going to be what's known as the Spanish-American War. You guys explored this to some degree in the U.S. too, so I'm going to gloss through a lot of it. But in 1898, there still is a European outpost in the Americas. There still is one last undying fragment of the old Spanish Empire. Spain, which going back to the time of Columbus, it had most of the Caribbean, it had Mexico, pretty much all of South America except Brazil. That old Spanish Empire was gone. It had been gone for many years, but it still had Cuba. There had been a number of movements within Cuba to kick the Spanish out, but had been unsuccessful. In 1898, the U.S. sees an opportunity to help Cuba win its independence and kick the Spanish out. It takes that opportunity. It invades Cuba in 1898. The Spanish kind of crumble really, really quick. They don't really have much of a navy. Much of their military installations in Cuba are kind of weak. And the U.S. kicks them out with minimal casualties. This was made very famous in the career of President Theodore Roosevelt. Before he becomes president, he gets in charge of his own cavalry, known as the Rough Riders. He goes to Cuba, achieves a degree of heroism on the battlefield. He famously charges up a location known as San Juan Hill. He lobbies really hardcore to get awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He doesn't get it, but he really is proud of the fact that he did this. He really enjoys the physical contest of battle. And he goes on within a couple years to be vice president and president. Like really quick. Like within 3 years, he goes from being a colonel in the Spanish-American War to being president. As a result of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. is in de facto control of Cuba. But on paper, it was helping Cuba win its independence. More on that in a second. Later on, when Roosevelt becomes president, he follows up on the Monroe Doctrine. And he creates what's known as the Roosevelt Corollary, the Roosevelt follow-up to this Monroe Doctrine, which no longer just says we want Europe out of the Western Hemisphere, but we're willing to use military force to keep them out. And Roosevelt's all about that. He's very proud of his of the U.S. Navy, which is built up during his time. We know he sends the U.S. to Panama to foment a revolution, and he's very much involved in the building of the Panama Canal. So Theodore Roosevelt is prepared to do what he has to do to make sure Latin America conforms to U.S. interests. And the other policy, and I really want to stress this one probably more than any of the others, it's this general policy the U.S. creates in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. It's called dollar diplomacy. And what that means, it's carried out in Cuba, but elsewhere as well, that the U.S. is going to send loans from U.S. banks. It's going to encourage U.S. business interests to go to Latin America, to go to Cuba, build up the sugar industry with U.S. corporations, give out loans from U.S. banks to various Cuban banks and other institutions. And in doing so, this will achieve two things. Dollar diplomacy gets you two things. Number one, it makes things stable. It provides adequate consumer goods for the people that live there. It maybe stabilizes their financial situation with the loans. But secondly, it buys you influence. Sure, Cuba now has its independence. They're no longer ruled by Spain. But many of their people are employed by U.S. companies, and many of their financial institutions and parts of their government are on the hook to U.S. banks for loans. So it's very difficult in that sense to do things that are contrary to U.S. interests. Later on, observers of foreign policy are going to call this economic imperialism. We don't have to be there with our soldiers and our military units. We can be there with our corporations and our bank loans as a way of controlling and manipulating what goes on. This is where dollar diplomacy is practiced in action. If you look closely on here, you see various military and financial behaviors by the United States, sending economic aid to Nicaragua, taking on Puerto Rico as a U.S. possession. That's, by the way, another thing. The Spanish-American War gets the U.S. not only Cuba, but also Puerto Rico and the Philippines. So if you were wondering in the news recently why Puerto Rico's natural disaster is partially a U.S. issue, is because Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States, and that goes back to the Spanish-American War. I want you to keep this cartoon in mind. Who's the individual in the center? Probably able to identify his face. Someone just want to shout it out. Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. This was kind of making fun of him during his presidency. This is the Caribbean Sea, and he's, carrying around the U.S. Navy like it was his toy Navy, and this was a bathtub or a kid's swimming pool. And he's marching around like he owns the joint. And Roosevelt organized much of his political life around this philosophy of speak softly but carry a big stick. It goes back to an African proverb that he was always drawn to, which is you want to speak softly and communicate your point without a lot of controversy, but if that doesn't work, you need to be prepared to back it up with force. And this is what he called big stick diplomacy. You saw what he did with the Panama Canal on Tuesday, and he makes other interventions to make it clear that Latin America is very much part of the U.S. sphere of influence. Here he is during the Spanish-American War. This is him in his military outfit, pointing the cannon at the King of Spain. All right, before we get to the last slide, we're going to do this interpretive piece of text. You've got the numbers out in front of you. Fidel Castro. You guys, if you've gotten a jump start on your reading, you may have been familiar with him. Cuba's history, as we know, is deeply intertwined with that of the U.S. The U.S. went to war to kind of help Cuba win its independence, but kind of maintain its stay in Cuba afterwards and deeply influenced their politics. When he came to power in 1959, 1960, the Cuban leader Fidel Castro gave a speech to the United Nations General Assembly. And in that speech, he made a lot of references to Cuban history. This was, as I said, a lot of those truths that were very apparent if you're looking at a Latin American point of view, if you're looking at a Cuban point of view towards the United States. And I want to read you this excerpt from Castro's speech, which were known to be very lengthy. All you have to do is, I'd like you to summarize it in one sentence. We've done this drill before. So summarize what Castro is saying in one sentence, as succinct as you can. So this is what Castro says in 1960 after he first comes to power. Then began the new colonization of our country, the acquisition of the best agricultural lands by the United States firms, concessions of Cuban natural resources and mines, concessions of public utilities for exploitation purposes, commercial concessions of all types. These concessions, when linked with the constitutional right, constitutional by force, of intervention in our country, turned it from a Spanish colony into an American colony. Let us not deceive ourselves, since by doing so we only make ourselves ridiculous. Let no one be mistaken. There was no independent republic. There was only a colony where orders were given by the ambassador of the United States. The military group which tyrannized our country was supported by the most reactionary elements of the nation, and above all by foreign interests that dominated the economy of our country. Everybody knows, and we understand, that the government of the United States admits it, that the type of government favored by the monopolies. Why? Because by the use of force, it was possible to check the demands of the people. By the use of force, it was possible to suppress strikes for improvement of living standards. By the use of force, it was possible to crush all movements on the part of the peasants to own the land they worked. By the use of force, it was possible to curb the greatest and most deeply felt aspirations of the nation. That is why governments of force were favored by the ruling circles of the United States. That is why governments of force stayed in power for so long, and why there are governments of force still in power in America. What's Castro saying in one sentence? Take a minute or so. He uses the word force quite a bit. You want to have something in front of you. Please do not go on autopilot here. And don't be surprised if you see this again, or a part of this again. Number 29. Where are you, 29? No 29? If we stay silent, he won't pursue us. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe it's at a blank. Is it at a blank table? Anybody who's in the high 20s, can you see it? Okay. 26. Go ahead. Cuba's been taken by force and been passed around by other countries. Yeah, that's how you use the word force, and Castro would agree with you there. Number 8. Where are you, 8? Go ahead. Yeah, what was the first part about not lying to yourself? Okay. Yeah, and he's giving this at the United Nations, and he's telling the international community. I like how you say that. Don't lie to yourselves. We've just changed the names of the colony. That's pretty much it. Number 14. We have a 14. Didn't finish it. 21. $32. I'm really unlucky in this lottery here. 36. There's no 36. Don't have anything? 40. Okay, go ahead.
Cuba basically just became an American colony. America just stopped.
Yeah, Cuba became an American colony, and we should own up to that fact. Yeah, okay. So, final slide here. Last one in the last 3 or 4 minutes. Cuba before Castro. So I started with Castro so you see his view of history in mind, and now we're going to go back in time. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S., while it leaves Cuba, militarily speaking, and it gives it the right to form its own independent government, there are some very serious qualifiers with that. So Cuba becomes kind of a de facto U.S. protectorate after the Spanish-American War. And what that means is that, yes, they had their own government, but the U.S. military and the U.S. financial interests were always kind of right there, making sure nothing was deeply out of sync with what they wanted. So one of the ways this was implemented, you might wonder, how does the U.S. maintain this? If they're independent, they should be independent. Well, in the terms that were initially set for how the U.S. gets out of Cuba, how it actually removes its military force, Congress created what was called the Platt Amendment. And you don't need to know the Platt Amendment, but just know that these were the types of stipulations that were placed on Cuba. The Platt Amendment said that in order for the U.S. to withdraw, Cuba had to agree not to run any public debts. So right there, that's a huge financial shackle on Cuba, that the government is not able to take on debts in order to finance things that it needs. It has to kind of live within its own revenue streams. Additionally, Cuba will leave, but we're going to create a naval base in Cuba. A U.S. military base that's still in existence to this day. We know it as Guantanamo Bay. That's a product of the Spanish-American War. Additionally, the U.S., please do not pack up until the very end. The U.S. has it written into Cuba's constitution that if another foreign power were to show up in Cuba and maybe start manipulating or controlling its government or threatening it, the U.S. had the power and the right to intervene in Cuba's affairs. That's what we mean when we kind of say protectorate. And this government kind of maintains itself all throughout the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, 40s. Various presidents take office. There's a constitution. There's a Congress. That goes on under the close supervision of the United States. The guy who ultimately comes to power in Cuba by the 1940s and 50s is this guy named Fulgencio Batista. You read about him in one of the documents yesterday. He was a former president of Cuba who was legitimately elected, but in the 1950s, when there was some uncertainty over the government, he seizes power in a military coup. He's a military guy. You see him up there on the cover of Time magazine. And he serves a couple purposes. For the U.S., who backs him, he's a military guy. He's going to keep Cuba open to U.S. businesses. U.S. organized crime is going to have a big kind of run of the shop in Cuba as well. They're going to be very much involved in the gambling and hotel industry. And finally, this is the key thing that Batista does. He restricts the press and jails political opponents, has people killed, pretty much does what he needs to keep Cuba open for business. He's the guy that Castro overthrows in 1959. Keep that in your mind as you're reading for the Socratic discussion. Have a good weekend. Exit through the library doors.